Well now, there's just been another new late Ediacaran Lagerstrata announced, and this time from North China rather than South China, so a different continental block. It's called the Dongpo Biota, and it is from very roughly the same age as the Tongshan Biota, which we looked at recently. So I'm going to take a dive into this, see what it tells us, and also it gives me some backup for discussing another weird Ediacaran fossil called Yilingia, so I'm going to get onto that one as well. Right then, we're going back to the Ediacaran. Firstly, thanks to Igloo for pointing this out as soon as it was published. I hadn't seen it at that point. And it's not open access, but I got a copy of the paper from Zhang Xingliang, one of the authors, and so I can show you the highlights and tell you what it's all about. Oddly, I think it's also relevant to a mysterious critter called Yilingia spicifpormis, which was previously described from elsewhere from the late Ediacaran as a bilaterian worm with its trail or burrow preserved behind it. And I've always been sceptical of that, and now I've got a lot more backup in my reason to be sceptical, so I'm going to get onto that a bit at the end as well. But firstly, the Dongpo Biota. This is from North China, which at the time was a completely separate continental block from South China. They're in the same region of the world, but equatorial latitudes off the coast of Gondwana, and they have separate tectonic and geological histories. So this is a different continent. That's important because any similarities that we're seeing between here and, say, the Tongshan Biota are therefore more significant than if they were right next door to each other. The age of this deposit is, like many of them, not brilliantly well constrained, because we don't have graptolites to sort us out. I mean, it's limited when you haven't got graptolites. But what we do know is that it is after a late Ediacaran glaciation event, and that narrows it down to the interval between about 538 and 550 million years. So this is the last part of the Ediacaran. And this deposit appears to be roughly in the middle of that sedimentary range, even if it's not temporal range. Assuming that there is approximately even sedimentation through that sequence, though, we're looking at maybe 543, 544 million years, something like that. But we can't be that precise and definite. The rock sequence is apparently yellowish-green sandstone, siltstone and mudstone or shale through a thickness of about 86 metres, which is a reasonable thickness, but the fossils are all from one pretty narrow interval in the middle. And those fossils are only in the shale and the siltstone, not the sandstone, and it seems to be different assemblages in the siltstone and the shale. So in some ways you've actually got two different types of fossil community here. Now, the dominant groups by number are apparently algae, macroalgae. And these are entirely, as far as I can make out, in the shale. So you have a completely different community in the shale than you do in the siltstone, which is interesting. But in terms of the total diversity, it gets really quite peculiar, because they have collected a total of 5,373 specimens, representing a combined total of, wait for it, 10 species. That's not a great deal. It's in fact remarkably low, but 10 species is what they've got. And what they have is a range of preservational styles between the two rock types, and starting with the algae, it's actually really nice material. At least, I assume it's nice material because the two specimens they illustrate are nice. But these consist of only two species. We have a glomulus, which is a very fine filamentous thing. It looks a bit like a cyanobacteria, but I believe it is meant to be an alga. And then you have Vendotinia, which is a ribbon-like thing with what's described as an obscure holdfast, which I think means that it's not even definitely there. But you have these two types of very different appearing algae, and these form, as far as I can make out, the entire assemblage of the fossils in the mudstone. What's interesting though is the preservation is actually quite nice. It's carbonaceous compressions, it's a sort of thing that you get in Burgess Shale type faunas and floras in the Ediacaran. It's very similar to the sort of Tongshan Biota type of preservation that we see in this mudstone. It's a shame there doesn't seem to be anything else in the mudstones, but what we have there is actually really nice preservation, and you would hope potentially that other things that were there, such as at least more robust animals, slightly cuticularized things, perhaps petalonions, these fronds that you get in the Ediacaran, if they were there, you would expect them to be preserved as well, to some extent at least. You would hope so. Okay, in the siltstone we get a very different assemblage. Most of this is quite familiar stuff. So, familiar, but often very enigmatic. So we have the bizarre palaeontologist and Horodiscia, which are sort of chains or arrangements of ball-shaped structures. And these are of unknown affinity. They're often assumed to be protists of some sort. I think the evidence is unclear, but they are definitely not animals, I think it's fair to say, and they don't seem to be algae, and they're well, I think algae is a possibility for some of them, but there's nothing quite like them live today. But they are enigmatic organisms, which are very, very common in this age of rocks around the world, really. They're quite abundant things. Alongside those, we have another very common thing, which is aspidella, which basically a little circular discoidal structure which appears to be the holdfast of one of these typical Ediacaran fronds of some sort. It's not brilliant preservation of these, but there are some apparently. The next other big thing that they have preserved are tubes. Again, just two species, two forms. Shansilithes, which is quite well known and common, even in North China it was known before. And Wutubus, which is much less common but does occur with it. And this time in the late Ediacaran is characterized particularly by a diversity of tubular organisms or tubular structures secreted by organisms. And these are often assumed to be animals of some form. There's very little direct evidence as to what sort of thing produced them. There are cnidarians, for example, that make a lot of tubes. There are also worms. There are various other things. Many people presume these to be at least cnidarians, maybe bilaterians, but the evidence is unclear or enigmatic in a lot of these things, ambiguous. So at some point I will get onto a video just looking at these tubes and what we can actually say about them, what we can't say about them, and where the possibilities still lie in terms of interpretation. But there are these two types of tubes. Organic structures of some sort made by something we're not sure about. There are also very rare trace fossils, very simple things called archaeonassa, narrow, sinuous trails, and that is most of the community. There is one other thing, which is a unique, what they describe as elongate fronds. But these are a little different. When we refer to fronds, it's a descriptive term of a sort of strap-like thing, a bit like various seaweeds like kelp today. It is not a taxonomic term. If we wanted to be taxonomic about this and we're talking about the typical Ediacaran fronds, we'd be referring to petalonions, for example. And in this case, they're talking about a frond, because this thing is quite distinct from the petalonions. They describe it as lacking the second order branches, which is basically all the things to the side, and also lacking a zigzag suture, which is one of the characteristic things that gives you this offset glide symmetry. So the branches come off alternately on either side. And in fact, what you're left with is simply this, effectively a line of chevrons. And they are preserved as quite high resolution casts and moulds, they call them, but I think this is the impression of the fossil, of the organism, onto a bedding surface with algal mats on it, and then that has been infilled by more sediment after the fossil is decayed. I think that's what's going on, but they don't give clear orientations. So we're left with this peculiar structure which has no actual midline. It's a series of chevron-like structures attached one after the other. And the authors describe this as showing first-order branches originating alternately on either side of the central axis. That's not what I actually see here. And you could argue that one side of these chevrons is slightly longer than the other, and sometimes this may be an alternating pattern, but most of the time they seem to be pretty much equal length on either side. So this is a very peculiar structure, but it is in the form of a long, thin frond with spiky outline. They don't name it, they don't discuss it further in terms of its affinities, they just leave it as that, which, when you discover something new, is sometimes all you can do. When you see something new like this, it's often difficult to work out what to do with it. In terms of the preservation, though, these impressions into these algal mat-covered surfaces, it looks like it's been preserved in exactly the same way as you would expect for a standard Ediacaran. So one of these petal ornaments or articulatums, things like Dickinsonia, it looks like it's made of the same sort of material, it has left impressions in the same sort of way, and so there's no reason to assume it is something very different from that sort of type of body construction. We don't see any internal structure, it's just the impression of the surface, and that impression is intermittently very well preserved and quite weakly preserved, just presumably because of the properties of the mat where it was came to rest against it, or even whether there has been movement or a little bit of decay as it sort of, well, you can imagine this thing sort of flopping down onto the sediment surface, leaving an impression, decaying there after the bacteria in the mats have actually formed a nice solid structure, and then sediment washing in over the top and sinking down into the mould after the animal or organism has decayed. Okay, that is interesting in its own right. It shows us that if there were other organisms here, rangiomorphs or whatever it is you would like to get in the Ediacaran, they should have left some trace of themselves. And you could argue that there are rarer things there that haven't been found yet, but they collected over 5,000 specimens, so they've put some effort into this. Which means that probably we do have a very low diversity ecology here. And it's even lower than the 10 species in total because 2 of them, these algae, seem to be only in a slightly different sedimentary environment which is being deposited, interbedded with each other in the same location. So we've got 2 species of algae on the one side, which is actually not unprecedented. There are other exceptionally preserved floras from the Ediacaran where you have that low diversity. I'm thinking of things like the zoonarts. But then in the siltstone you have mats, you have these problematic things like Palaeopachycnus, you have Aspidella discs, which may well be the holdfasts of these fronds which are attached somewhere. There are a couple of types of tube, and you have not very much else. These very rare sinuous trails on the surface. And yeah, that's really it. It's a very low diversity ecosystem. But that is not uncommon. There are quite a few Ediacaran assemblages where we don't see very much diversity at all. It's just a few species that seem to do okay in that particular location. Is this because we don't have good enough preservation to preserve softer things? To some extent, almost certainly yes. I'm sure there would have been algae, for example, in the siltstone layers, but the preservation style is different and we're not seeing them. So those really delicate filamentous things, if in the siltstone it was more aerobic, you had more decay, there's no carbon traces left in any of these things, you wouldn't see them because they don't leave an impression in the siltstone. So almost certainly there were softer things like these very delicate algae in the siltstone which have not been preserved. Would there have been other things in the mudstone alongside the algae that were preserved which were not? Probably very small and extremely soft, delicate things that don't even have cellulose, but in general, anything more robust, like a lot of the stuff that we're seeing in the siltstone, you would expect to have been preserved in the mudstone as well. So we don't have a really high-level Lagerstätte here, is what I'm saying. We're not seeing everything in either assemblage, but it's not bad, and it is showing us something about what was living here, and these things would not normally be expected to be preserved. So it's interesting. What's really interesting is this other data point that we have in comparison with something like Tongshan. Different continent, and yet again we have paleopachycnus, we have fronds, we have tubes of various types, very similar types. And it is an extremely similar community type. There's a bit more diversity in Tongshan and a bit better preservation, but this is interesting and it is consistent with the pattern we see there. Although we can assume that there were more things here that weren't fossilised, we don't actually see that for certain. We don't know for sure that there were other things there because, of course, we don't see them. And what we do see is a consistent pattern. Remember, this is late in the Ediacaran. This is only a few million years, probably, before the start of the Cambrian, where we get really recognisable animals all over the place. And what do we have that could be animal? Various things, depending on how you want to interpret them, including those tubes, which quite likely were some sort of animal, albeit maybe Cnidarian more than bilaterian. It's just we don't have information really to help us separate those possibilities. But it's really interesting. We don't see anything like a really complex, obvious animal here at all. Even the trace fossils are tiny little sinuous surface trails which are just as likely to be protists as they are animals. So that's really interesting, and to me this is reinforcing the pattern that we have. If you go back to the Cambrian explosion video that I did, where I go through all the different lines of evidence, it's this lack of obvious animals in the latest Ediacaran when we would really expect to see them that I find most compelling for the Cambrian explosion being a real evolutionary event, with the diversification of bilaterians especially, and probably not long after the other animal groups, very close to the end of the Ediacaran. Okay, that's enough for this one, except I now want to draw attention to a thing called Yilingia, and then come back to the Dongpo. So, Yilingia spicifpormis was published in Nature in 2019 to great fanfare. In fact, the title was Death March of a Segmented and Trilobate Bilaterian Elucidates Early Animal Evolution. So, yeah, no great claims there, eh? What they claim to have had is this worm-like animal with a sort of plated, segmented morphology, preserved at the end of their trails or burrows. This is from the Shibantan member of South China, the same fossil assemblage as that supposed Lobopodian trackway that we had a look at recently and created some problems about. But it's actually by some of the same authors as well, but the same sort of deposit, the same age, and the same age as well as what we're seeing in North China with the Dongpo biota. Very latest part of the Ediacaran, not well constrained, but within 5 to 10 million years of the boundary. So the fossils that they described in this paper were slightly weird things. They appear to have a long, elongate body with an array of plates over the surface, including a midline of sort of hexagonal-ish plates going down the centre, and then ones coming off that at angles to generate something which is kind of unique. It has been compared with things like annelids, which have a segmented body plan, and then parapodia coming off the sides. The arrangement is a little bit different to that, but it's a strange sort of feature. Then some of these specimens appear to show one part of the fossil having this sort of very clear plated structure, and then that being continuous with an elongate, much smoother section of the fossil, which was interpreted as a burrow or trackway on the surface. Trackway would be the wrong term, but a sort of a trace fossil behind this animal, which had been moving along the sediment, left this sort of trail behind it, and then having the body fossil at the end. And there are a couple of specimens at least that show this sort of thing. And I had problems with this from the start. One of the main issues is that the trace fossil doesn't show a very clear demarcation at the back of the animal. And also some of the areas which are included as trace fossil show weak impressions of the plate structure as well, the same sort of patterning, which sort of fades out to the back of the animal, and then you see traces of that patterning in the apparent trace fossil. It gets a little more complex when you actually look at the thickness, the width of this trace as well, because in at least some specimens, it's actually significantly thinner than the animal itself. It seems to be gradually tapering towards the end which is regarded as the trace fossil, because it doesn't show the detail in it. And this is a problem, because you can't have something really moving through the sediment and leaving a trail behind that is, in some cases, about half the width of the animal that made it. It also doesn't show any ridges, lateral areas where the sediment has been displaced to the side. You compare that with a typical Ediacaran trace fossil like Helminthoidicnites, and you can clearly see the sediment is displaced in the middle towards the outside. And if this is some sort of worm moving through the sediment, why isn't it leaving any trace of the sediment behind it? Where's the sediment going? It's a peculiar arrangement for a trace fossil. Combine that with the fact that there is no clear distinction between the two, and that you have faint traces of the same sort of patterning in an area which are meant to have been a movement trace, so therefore all of that would have been smeared away. And you have an alternative interpretation of this, which is that the whole thing is actually some sort of body fossil. It's just better preserved in some areas than others. You can imagine this being a tall, frond-like, in the sense I meant earlier, so descriptive sense, organism which had fallen onto the surface, and the surface texture, the sculpture of that body, has been impressed into the surface, better preserved in some parts than others. It explains why it tapers, and you've basically got a very elongate, frond-like organism. This has been argued in many cases to be not possible to be related to the Ediacaran fronds, because it doesn't have a zigzag suture, it doesn't have the glide symmetry. It's been described as a true bilaterian, a strict bilateral symmetry. And you look at this structure and yeah, it's more or less bilateral symmetry. You seem to have this line down the centre of polygons with the bits coming off equally on either side. Does that preclude it being anything other than a bilaterian? Well, of course it doesn't, because there's all sorts of plants that have bilateral symmetry, for example. There are all sorts of things where bilateral symmetry can appear without it being a bilaterian. So, could this be a bilaterian? Theoretically, possibly. Could it be something else? I would also say very theoretically, possibly. If you don't accept that apparent trace behind it as being an actual ichneofossil of something moving over the surface, and from what I can see in the material that's been published, I don't see good reason to believe that it is a trace fossil. I think it's just a weakly preserved, maybe decayed, maybe just less well impression of a continuous part of an elongate body form. So if you don't accept that as a trace fossil, then a tall, thin, frond-like organism is to me just as likely, if not more so, given the age when we know that there are lots of frond-like organisms of various sorts around at the time. Of course, when it's a unique one-off thing, where there's nothing else described in the world that's anything like it in terms of the structure, even the symmetry of it, then yeah, it starts to become more difficult to come down on one side or another, because you've got nothing to compare with. But of course, when we first started finding the Ediacaran biota, we had nothing to compare with. Every time we find something new, there is nothing to compare with. So to me, this one is kind of in limbo until we find something that shows some similarities. So let's go back to this weird elongate frond-like thing from the Dongpo biota, because the structures there are not all that dissimilar to what we see in Yilingia. There is the same bilateral symmetry. It appears to be not glide symmetry. The description suggests that these things are alternating either side, but that's not what the images show. These appear to be a stack of chevron-like things, just one after the other, forming a single frond with a spiky outline. If you compare that with what we see in Yilingia, compare that with that central part of the sort of pleated structures in the middle of the midline of this organism, and extend the upper corners up, you have something which starts to very closely resemble this new frondo structure from the Dongpo. I'm not saying it's very closely related, but the point is there is structural continuity here. We have something with bilateral symmetry composed of a column of plate-like surface sculptures which have extensions. In Yilingia, there are separate extensions with these little lateral branches coming off, described as a parapodia for a worm-like thing. And in the Dongpo fossil, there are continuous spinose extensions of that central axis. That's not that different. Body form is very similar. It's very elongate, narrow, slender, frond-like thing. The preservational style is very similar. It's even impressed into these maps in the same sort of way. It fades out in places, it's well preserved in others. To me, it's hard to argue that these have to be completely fundamentally different things, because with this new thing from the Dongpo, it looks to me as if we have a possible analogy with Yilingia. Okay, so could this be something which is bilaterian, and the Dongpo one is also bilaterian, that they are both worm-like organisms rather than fronds? In that case, where is the evidence supporting that? Because there is nothing worm-like today that looks anything like this, and that's not precluding that there was some early branch of bilateria that evolved to look like that. I mean, it would be completely different to its ancestors, I would imagine, but you can't rule out something like that. The problem is that we don't have the evidence one way or the other. Just want to throw in one more thing, because there's a huge amount being made of the difference between true bilateral symmetry and glide symmetry. But I just want to mention another paper from 2023 by Grimes et al. From the Ediacaran biota of South Australia, where they described, let me just get the name right, Akrophyllas, which was a very elongate, frond-like organism, a petal ornament. I think they were happy with it being, but it has some different features, and it's very slender compared with some of the others. The lateral branch is very short. And they describe it having the zigzag medium septum as, or zigzag midline, as is an important feature for these things. But then in some of their illustrations, it has the offset lateral branches in part of the frond, but when you go to the apex of the frond, that offset disappears. And suddenly it starts to look a lot more like this thing from the Dongpo biota. So I think it's entirely possible that you can have a continuum between normal petalonomons and things like Yilingia and this new Dongpo frond by simply having flexibility in whether there is a definite midline with offset either side, or whether there are lateral branches, whether it's extended outwards, and you end up with a continuum, meaning that these are probably, to me, all the same general group of organism. Does that mean I'm right? Absolutely not. I'm not even a specialist in the Ediacaran. I've seen an awful lot of fossils over the years. I've worked with very difficult and problematic things. I like to think I've got a fairly good grasp of quite a wide range of stuff, but I am not a specialist in this. I've never actually worked on these fossils myself. But even if I had, that wouldn't mean that I was necessarily right. It doesn't mean that anyone else is necessarily right either. With this sort of material, we're kind of not taking a stab in the dark, but we are interpreting these fossils based on our best understanding of how we see the evidence being presented for them. And it's not entirely clear one way or another quite often. And this is why the Ediacaran is so difficult to work on. In the Cambrian, most of the time, you know what sort of fossil you're looking at, because we have pretty much 100% certainty that there is continuity with things that are absolutely categorically the same major group as something alive today. As soon as you cross into the Ediacaran, everything starts to become a lot more ambiguous. And this, to me, is one of the most telling points about the nature of the Cambrian explosion. Because we have this 500 million years, effectively, of continuity of at least phylum level for almost all fossils, phylum level distinctions going back to the Cambrian. And then you drop below the Cambrian and everything changes. Suddenly you have matte grounds everywhere. The trace fossils all are a little bit different. We don't have anything like the complexity of the deep burrowing and complex behaviours. And then the fossils themselves, they're either tubes, which were clearly made by something, but they don't leave much trace of what, or they're even more ambiguous things. The preservation of the fossils is even really weird. And you look at something like Yilingia, and it's so hard to get your head around what exactly the form of the organism was that made that fossil and how. Was it a burrow with the impression of the animal at the end? I don't think so. I think that is basically an impression of where something came to rest on the sediment and was moulded in this microbial mats that covered the surfaces. But I don't know if that is the correct answer. And I'm sure some of you in the comments will be absolutely adamant that I got it totally wrong. But this is how I see it. Like the Lobopodian trackway, allegedly, that we saw before, I think there are completely different ways of interpreting some of these fossils. And the critical thing is at what point we have a recognisable mobile bilaterium in the fossil record. And I'm probably going to be dealing with the other few supposedly really 100% clear examples, like Icaria, which, yeah, don't get me started on Icaria yet. But when you start looking in detail at these things, what I really want to get across is that there are usually other ways of interpreting these fossils, that you look at them with a bit of an analytical mindset, you try to work out what these fossils are really showing you, and you may come to very different conclusions to what was published. Because the publication is by people who have been working on these, and they've read the evidence to come to one conclusion. Just as much as it doesn't mean I'm right if I say what I think they are, it doesn't mean that someone who publishes a paper in this area is right either. We need to keep this sense of skepticism. That's what science is all about. accepting what is published as being absolutely correct without challenging it doesn't get us anywhere. That's not science. So, yeah, I don't want to just sort of try to kick over everyone's discoveries in the Precambrian, but it sometimes feels that way because there are so many things that are published and then celebrated in the media as being, a definite worm from the Ediacaran. And I look at it and go, oh, not again. In much the same way as I do for sponges. I haven't done any much on those yet, but don't worry, I will be coming to them. I just got to do some other things in the background so that it all comes out at once. Anyway, there's lots more to talk about with these Ediacaran weirdies, and even what is the nature of these tubes is something I'd like to get onto. Also, what can make trace fossils that match up with the things we see in the Ediacaran? That is a complex question in itself, and it is not necessarily just animal. So much to do. Oh well, hope you'll stick with me for the rest of it. Thank you again for listening, and try not to have a fit at the heresies that I'm promulgating here. Remember that my ideas are not necessarily correct either. What I'm trying to do is get across the reasons why I have these ideas, to give you ways of thinking about them, to allow you to be a little bit more circumspect in what we take for granted in what has been published and what we think maybe not. We'll see. Please do subscribe, and if you're one of those amazing people who would like to help support the channel and support what I do and give me more time for research, then we do have a membership option available for £4 a month, in which you also get bonus material where we dive into unpublished work that we can't put into the public domain yet. So, I'll see you again sometime soon, I hope. Ta-ra the no! And Lucy's just pointed out that I seem to be wearing a rangeomorph as well.